So our speaker tonight is Chris Castor, who will talk about gulls. And as usual, we will have Karen introduce our speaker since she's the one who does all the hard work of getting us speakers.
Well, it is my extreme pleasure to have Chris Castor, a past president of the Iowa City Bird Club and a very talented artist, biologist. Of course, he's a dentist in his regular job, but he knows more about gulls than anybody that I have ever come up against, except for maybe Tom Kent. So with that, I give you Chris Castor.
Good grief, Karen. Hey, how is my microphone? Is it good? Okay. All right. Well, I had to laugh when you called me a birder extraordinaire, Karen, because I thought maybe you were starting a creative writing class or something. But seeing as how we're up against an Iowa basketball game and I have no particular credentials to speak of, you had to come up with something. So I guess I should thank you and get on with that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. And here is my first slide. Let's see. And let me see if I can start the slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this presentation is going to be loosely based on the field trip I lead each February to the Quad Cities. And if you haven't been along, it can be chilly. I learned a lot in putting this together, including proper gull terminology. Flock of seagulls is something that you had on your dorm wall back in the 80s. Okay, gulls like landfills. And this is what they're called in Britain. I also learned that there is a name for my disorder, and I hope you can all see that. It's kind of covered up on my screen. Whoop. It's a larophile, and this comes from the word larus, which is the genus to which all the large white-headed gulls belong. So why am I a larophile? Well, for one, they are beautiful, and I love watching birds fly. This magnificent bird is an adult glaucous gull. Glaucous is a word that means gray. The younger birds regularly show up in Iowa, but I've only once seen an adult of this bird. And that was in Des Moines decades ago. These are two of my favorites. The one on the left is a Franklin's gull, and the one on the right is a Bonaparte's gull. And they migrate through Iowa in large numbers, but most are gone by December. And these birds are both in winter plumage, and we have never seen them and wouldn't expect to see them on our February field trip, but I particularly like these two. I also like gulls because they are fun, and apparently they enjoy ice cream. And if the Brits would learn to serve burgers with their chips, they wouldn't have this problem. Some gulls have a taste for beer, and you shouldn't be alarmed because this is an adult bird. Of course, the youngsters can make fools of themselves. Not everyone appreciates gulls as I do, and sometimes measures must be taken. Some are more successful than others. But seagulls are welcome here. This picture happens to be from the Seattle waterfront. I didn't take this picture, but it looks very familiar to me as I've visited this place a few times. This right here is a map of the stretch of the river that we normally bird in February. We make numerous stops between Rapid City, Illinois, which would be, if you can see my cursor, it would be up here in the upper right-hand corner. And we bird various areas between there and Credit Island on the south side of Davenport. I think it's interesting when I look at a map that the Mississippi River actually flows from the northeast to the southwest through this stretch. And oftentimes when we look across the river, we're actually looking south. Some of the better gull places that we stop at are Lock and Dam 14. And this is the view from the Illinois side. There's a large earthen dike that we can walk across all the way out to the spillway and have nice views of gulls flying around there. There's also often some ice to the north of this where gulls will be roosting. And there's some good spots on the Iowa side too, but I find the Illinois side a little bit better. This is a view of the Ben Butterworth Parkway. It's in Moline. So we'll cross the I-74 bridge often, and there are many spots where you can park along the river and get out. And there's usually something interesting at different points. This is a view of Lock and Dam 15 from Davenport. This is a good spot, not quite as good as Lock and Dam 14 because there's no ice for the gulls to roost on, but oftentimes you'll see them up on these cement pillars. And of course, they'll be flying around, competing with the eagles for fish. And the other really good spot is at Credit Island on the south side of Davenport. There's a backwater, which this is a view of that. And oftentimes it's frozen over like what you see here. And there will be large groups of gulls roosting on the ice. So I'm sure most of you have bird guides. And when you go look at gulls, there are some, you know, anatomical things to consider. And I suggest that that you just, study these before you go out and learn what's visible on a flying bird versus a standing bird. The primary feathers on gulls have some special terminology associated with those. And all gulls have 10 primary feathers, and the outermost primary is number 10. This white circle, kind of toward the tip of the feather, is often referred to as a mirror. And oftentimes the adult gulls will have one or two, maybe more primaries that have mirrors on them. These are good field marks for certain birds. The other thing that you want to notice is these, I'm losing my cursor, these gray areas that extend down into the black are called tongues. And in certain birds, they can be quite white and produce patterns on the upper wing that are that help differentiate one bird from another. The other thing to note is that these black areas are black because they're heavily laden with a substance called melanin. And melanin has the advantage of making the feathers much more resistant to wear. And that you'll see how that's important to these birds. The winter time is probably the best time to learn about gulls. Their plumage is the freshest and the ages of the birds is most clear. These are ring-billed gulls in early winter of their first year. They are highly patterned and they're good to learn anatomy on. So I'm going to attempt with my cursor on this bird on the left to just to highlight some things. The first thing that you want to notice about, well, one of the things you want to notice about a bird is the bill. Is it straight? Um, does it have a prominent gonies? And this bird does not. The gonies is this little bulge kind of at the lower mandible right here. It makes a point, which can be quite heavy in some of the larger gulls. The head shape can be important. This bird, sometimes it has kind of a flattened crown to it, but some birds have a very kind of rounded crown, and others have a long sloping forehead, and that can be a clue as to what you're looking at. The back of the bird comprises two things. There's an area right on the top, which is often referred to as the mantle in gulls. There's also a feather um, section called the scapulars. And the scapulars is sort of like kind of right behind the shoulder on a bird. And in the standing bird, the scapulars will kind of cover the top of the wing panel. This right here is the wing panel, and it comprises a number of feather tracts, the most important being on the bottom. These are the greater wing coverts. Now, over here on this bird with the spread wing, the greater wing coverts are here. They're right above the secondaries. And oftentimes there's a strong contrast or not a contrast at all. And this also can be a useful field mark. On this standing bird, we also see some feathers called tertials. And these tertials are usually quite prominent in gulls, and their markings can be useful as well. However, on the flying bird, the tertials are quite hidden and really not a useful field mark. We also see the primaries on this standing bird, maybe not as well as on the flying bird, but it's still useful to note what's called the primary projection for some birds, which is the length of the primaries as they extend back from the tertial feathers. Also, sometimes it's good to note the length of these primaries relative to the tail. So also on this bird, we notice that it's got a dark eye, and most, well, maybe all immature gulls do. We have a base of the bill that's a slightly different color, and the legs, and we usually refer to this as maybe a flesh color. On this flying bird, the tail feathers actually have a band on them. So it's not the whole tail isn't black, but just the distal portion of the tail feathers. These are the base of the tail feathers. These feathers right here are the upper tail coverts, and then you have the rump. This is kind of a complicated area. For the most part, we would just say this bird has a white rump. On the wing, it's important to note in gulls the patterns in these primaries. These inner primaries are much lighter, and they create a little panel that we would refer to as a window, and that's important in some gulls. The outer primaries being dark, of course, on this bird. So when you look at a gull in flight, I right away I look for what's the color of the rump and what is the pattern in the wing. Do we see a primary window? Do we see a contrast with the greater coverts? This is an adult ring-billed gull. We know it's an adult because it's got, well, adult plumage. It's got black primaries with white mirrors in them or tips. It's got a pale yellow eye. It's got a fully yellow bill and legs. Birds go through a number of molts, and this is probably the most complicated thing about learning gulls. There's two basic systems. There's the winter versus summer plumage system, and that's probably the most easiest for the average birder to use. It's also recommended by people who write some pretty good field guides like David Sibley. But the truth of gull molt is far more complex and varies from gull to gull. And ornithologists and some of the people who write the more advanced field guides like a system that was devised in 1959 by some ornithologists that involves calling the winter plumage the basic plumage and referring to the summer plumage as the alternate plumage. Now, you wouldn't think that that would be any big deal. Why not just call it winter or summer? But the idea is that the basic plumage is a result of a pre-basic molt. This is a molt that all birds go through at some time of the year, where all the feathers are replaced on the bird, including the wing feathers and the tail feathers. Okay, and then there is a pre-alternate molt, which occurs before the alternate plumage, and where there's a limited replacement of feathers on the head and body. So just kind of keep those two things in mind, that there's a pre-basic molt and a pre-alternate molt. And they lead to the kind of basically the winter or the summer plumage. Now, the first pre-basic molt in gulls is actually the transition from the natal down of a bird in the nest to its juvenile plumage. When the first pre-alternate molt occurs is highly variable. So you have to sort of understand this terminology to really kind of get a handle on what's actually going on. Because some birds will start this pre-alternate molt in the fall, and some will start it in the spring. So to say that something is in a winter plumage, well, anyway, it's complicated. Let me just keep going on. The first molt cycle ends with the start of the second pre-basic molt. Okay, most of you are probably starting to gloss over at this point. So let me get to a slide that's not quite so dry. This is a juvenile ring-billed gull. Now, we know it's a juvenile bird because of its overall uniformly brown plumage. There really are no gray feathers in this bird to speak of. And you can tell from the grass that this is the summertime. This bird has probably been photographed maybe in July. Ring-billed gulls really don't breed in Iowa. There may be some records, but typically these birds are breeding in Minnesota or Wisconsin or someplace further north. This is a similar aged bird, kind of from the air. And we see on the back, it's still mostly kind of brown feathers. And you're seeing the same sort of upper wing pattern, the general pattern that we saw in one of those earlier slides. This bird right here is just a little bit further along. And you'll note that it's starting to show some gray in the scapulars. Not much else has changed, But this bird might be a bird that's in August. It's or early September. They start molting that soon. This particular bird. So it doesn't take too much longer in the fall for the ring-billed gull to look like this bird on the left. And we know the plumage is, it's fairly young because if you look at these primaries, they still have nice white, crisp little edgings to them that haven't worn off yet. There's still broad edgings to these tertial feathers. Um, so it does not take long for this bird to actually start its pre-alternate molt, which we think of as leading to the summer plumage. And winter hasn't even arrived yet. The bird on the right is the same bird, but probably in March or April. Okay. And this bird shows the evidence of continued molt. And most of our gulls are actually molting continuously. They can't just drop all their feathers at once. But what we see here is we see that the mantle and the scapulars are pretty gray. Um, the bill has a much more defined black tip to it. And other than that, what we're seeing is the wear and the fading of the pigments. And, being out in the winter, night and day for months, uh, takes its toll. And you can look at how ragged these feathers are, and all the white edgings are gone. And this is the benefit of having melanin in these flight feathers because melanin helps resist that wear. Otherwise, they'd be flying around with feathers that look like, well, these greater coverts that are pretty ragged looking. This is a ring-billed gull, a little bit further along. Now, this bird is well into its first, or I should say its second pre-basic molt. And I say this the second molt because the first one was already when it became a juvenile. But this is its first summer, and this bird is probably maybe in June. Um, Obviously, it's got the same feather wear that we saw in the other bird, but now we're starting to see more gray feathers kind of appear in the wing coverts, and it's losing its inner primaries, and the inner primaries go first. This bird is even rattier. It's a little farther along. Some of the inner primaries are starting to maybe grow in. I guess these right here. Its pattern of loss is a little bit different, but it's a little bit farther along. As it progresses, eventually it's going to get to this point. When all those flight feathers molt and the new ones come in, this is what the bird's going to look like at about age 18 months. So this is its second winter, and it looks very adult-like, but you will notice that it's still got a dark eye. It doesn't really have, it's got minimal white in the wingtips. They're very black, and this black pigmentation is also in some of these other feathers, wing feathers, and of course in the tail. So we know this is an adult bird. It wouldn't look like this if it was an adult. Now, this bird is a little bit farther along again. This bird might be in its second March. We're starting to see the eye kind of lighten up. We still, of course, because it hasn't molted these feathers yet this year, still has the black pigment in the tail, doesn't have any white in the wingtips, and the coloration of the bill is just starting to get maybe a little tinge of yellow, but they're still pretty greenish looking, greenish gray. And then about a year later or so, he'll end up like this. Nice rounded head, pale eye, yellow bill and legs. And at this stage, I think most people would be very confident in saying that this is a ring-billed gull. And here's the same bird with its wing extended. The dark streaking on the back of the head is pretty common for all the larger gulls um, in the wintertime. Um, and it's highly variable as to how much they have and how quickly they lose it in the spring. Okay, this bird is an adult herring gull. And let me switch to a different page here. Okay, so superficially, they are similar to ringbills. You still have the gray mantle and the dark primaries with the white mirrors, white tail. It's got a light eye in the adult bird. You don't see a dark ringbill, of course, but that shouldn't be the first thing that you look for because many herring gulls, when they're maybe not quite adult, maybe when they're in their third, fourth year, will have some black in the bill. And sometimes, if you're not used to looking at these birds, that may confuse you. But I can say that herring bills are always quite a bit larger than the ring-billed gulls. Herring gulls are a member of a whole Arctic complex that includes the lesser blackback gull. They are an ongoing challenge for taxonomists and birders. Um, the Europeans have different ideas about some of these birds than we do. Currently, the Europeans consider our herring gull as a separate species. They call it the American herring gull. So the challenges are even larger for the Europeans because they're trying to figure out how to separate our herring gulls that sometimes visit the British Isles from their own European birds. This is a juvenile herring gull. It's most notable for its uniform chocolate brown coloration. And really, that's its field mark. Um, if you see a bird with a dark bill, it's about the size of a herring gull, and it's uniformly dark like this, that's probably what it is. This bird is also a young herring gull, maybe a little bit older than the other one, as evidenced by the fact that it's got a lot of bleaching on the head and neck. So, I mean, it's probably been out in the elements for a while. It's a fairly uniform brown otherwise. It doesn't have the white rump like a ring-billed gull would at this age. The bill isn't quite all black. It's got some flesh tones there. And it's got a pale primary window, although I can't say that this bird has a whole lot of contrast. Most of the ones I see, it's more noticeable than this one. This bird has begun to mold its scapulars. You can see there's some gray in here. It's certainly sturdier looking than a ring-billed gull. It's got a longer bill with a more prominent gonies, this little angle right here. And some experts liken the shape of this gull to having kind of a pulled taffy look. And I think the idea is that if you were to grab a hold of this bill and pull it away from the face of the bird, it would sort of draw it in, almost like taffy. And a herring gull often has sort of this long sloping forehead. Only maybe the smaller females might have kind of a rounder head. Certainly large males, this is going to be even more accentuated. And I should maybe mention now that gulls do exhibit sexual dimorphism. The males tend to be a good bit larger than females, although it's not recommended that you try to sex the birds unless you see them in a mated pair.
Chris, there has been a question on just how big is this bird?
Sure. I think Sibley gives it as 27 inches, but I'm gonna really quickly flip my pages over here. And okay, well, the ring-billed gull, Sibley gives the length at 17.5 inches. And in the herring gull, he gives it at 25. So, I mean, that's, 17.5 to 25, that's almost you know, a third larger. So, when they stand side by side, it's quite obvious. Okay, now this bird actually looks a little bit smaller in here. I don't know where this photo was taken, but it's kind of interesting. This bird in the back, can't see much of it, but it looks like a western gull. Maybe it's just kind of the droop on this bill and kind of the expression. Um, Looks like that's what it might be, which is a larger bird than the herring gull. But this slide I just used to illustrate what being out in the sun and the wind will do to you. So put on your sunscreen. Here is the second winter bird. It seems to take an extra year for the herring to catch up to ringbills. Um, we see some gray feathers, but we see some brown feathers in the mantle and scapular. The bill is now black tipped. And like I said earlier, sometimes people will take a quick glance at this and think they've got a ring-billed gull when in fact it is a herring. So don't rely just on the bill. Um, this bird has a dark eye, but might be getting a little lighter. Any case, I don't use eye color very often because it's actually a hard thing to see. Of course, in this bird, this is a third winter or subadult herring gull. And you kind of liken this to that ring-billed gull I showed you that was 18 months old. It's got a gray mantle, it's got some black pigment in the tail. It still really doesn't have much black in the primaries. Pale eye. And this is the adult. And it's a fall adult. And I would say this because when I look at the primaries on this bird, they're very short. Okay, the primaries, they molt from the inside going out, and the last ones to come in are usually the 9th and 10th primaries, which are the ones that extend well past the tail. So this bird is a fall bird, but it has a classic kind of herring look with the long bill, um, the pale eye, the sort of taffy pull to the face, the sloping forehead, and the pink legs. Okay, this bird is a Thayer's gull, and it was first described in 1915 by the people who were gull experts at the time. One prominent guru, his name was Jonathan Dwight. This was considered a subspecies of the herring gull. But Mr. Dwight noted that it was very similar to the Kumlian's gull, which I will get to. This gull was named after a guy named John Elliott Thayer. Now, in the 1800s, it was still a time when people got birds named after them. John Thayer was from a wealthy Boston family, well connected to Harvard. He attended Harvard. In the 1890s, he got interested in ornithology and he started collecting eggs and skins and nests and he funded a lot of expeditions with his wealth, and he amassed a huge collection. And when he died in 33, Harvard got all his collection, and it included 3,500 mounted birds, 15,000 eggs and nests, and 28,000 skins. This is from Wikipedia. Okay, but you can certainly um, not be faulted for overlooking this Thayer's gull on the right amongst a flock of herrings. Okay, they are very similar, and one of the reasons why they were considered for a long time to be a subspecies of the herring gull. In fact, for a long time, because of that, nobody really kind of bothered with it or and knew what the field marks were. But I can tell you right now that the things that I look for are one, the bright pink legs, and just kind of the overall sort of uh, it's a slightly smaller bird. The head is typically more rounded. The bill is a little bit straighter and maybe a little more compact. Um, Oftentimes it looks a little paler to me. Um, the eye on many Thayer's gulls, maybe most, is dark, but that's not a for sure thing. Maybe 10 to 20% actually have light eyes. But the primary tips are usually a black color, and in the standing bird, really don't look that different from a herring. Here's a better look at the Thayer's gull, and the pink legs really kind of stand out. It sort of has a gentler look to it because of the rounded head and maybe the shorter bill than the herring. If you get a good look at its eye at the right time of the year, and this is more useful as you get closer to the breeding season, this area is a fleshy area called the orbital ring around that dark eye. And on Thayer's gulls, it's a pinkish, kind of purplish color. Um, on herring gulls, it's actually kind of a yellow or yellow-orange color. In flight, this is when I like to see the Thayer's gull because the big difference, and you can see this actually from quite a ways away if you're looking for it, is to look at the underwing. Okay, if you notice on this herring gull on the left, you see really dark primaries uh, that are apparent on the underside. Over here, and a lot of times it's lighter than this. This is actually quite a bit of pigment, but you don't see that. It's absent. And so when I'm scanning over a flock of gulls out over the water below the spillway, I'm looking for these undersides. Do I see one that doesn't have that dark? And right away I zero in on that and try to make an ID. Okay, this is another Thayer's gull, and obviously probably because of the way the light is and the translucency, how close this bird is. I mean, you see quite a bit on the underside, but um, don't pay attention to that right now. Pay attention to this upper wing. And on the Thayer's gull, um, if you think back to those primary feathers I showed you on an earlier slide, these tongues extend way down toward the tips. And in fact, the entire inner web, if you think of the shaft as having sort of an outer web on the outside and then an inner web, um, the shaft of the Thayer's gull's feathers on the inner web are typically don't have any of the melanin in them. And so you get this pattern on the upper wing where it's like it's sort of fingers of pigmentation. And that's readily apparent too when they're flying. And here's kind of a diagram that shows some of the feather detail that produces that, what you see in the flying bird. This area right here, I guess, that's important for Thayers. The juvenile birds These are first-year birds. The one on the left is a first-year herring, and the one on the right is a first-year Thayer's. I I generally feel comfortable that if I see a bird that's uniformly brown but sort of got a pale or frosted appearance, I'm pretty sure that's not a herring. And I think what you need to look at, of course, in this bird on the right, the primary feathers and the tertial feathers are really not all that different from the overall feather. On the overall feathers on the bird. On the herring gull, they're obviously much darker, and that should stand out to you if you've been looking at them for a while. The juvenile bird also has quite pink legs, and in flight, these are both Thayer's gulls. In flight, you still will notice that kind of primary window like you do on the herring, but overall you're looking at a much paler bird. On the underside of the Thayer's gull, you'll see sort of a silvery wing lining that sort of reflects the lack of pigmentation on the adult bird. You might notice a little bit of darkness kind of on the trailing edge of the primaries. This bird right here is called a Kumlian's gull, and it looks very much like the Thayer's gull. The eye on this bird is dusky, if not dark, um, but that's pretty variable in the Kumlian's gull. And the primaries, you notice, are not really black; they're more of a gray. This is a Kumlian's gull in the air. You notice this one's got a pale eye, and you see much less pigmentation in the primary feathers. And you'll learn that this is highly variable. Also, look at the underside of this wing over here. You don't really see much pigmentation at all. And that's something you can pick up in flight at a distance. Okay, so I showed you John Thayer. This is Ludwig Kumlian. He's of Swedish descent, but he was actually born in Wisconsin, and he attended college there, and he taught there. And in 1877 and 78, he was a naturalist on something called the Howgate Polar Expedition, and he spent a bunch of time looking at gulls on Baffin Island in some of the surrounding areas. And he identified and collected specimens of this bird that would become Comelian's gull. And it was kind of interesting at the time. He didn't know it was a new species. He actually thought it was a glaucous wing gull because the field marks were very similar. So let me. So anyway, the guy that decided it was a new species was a man named William Brewster. And William Brewster described it as such in 1883. He had taken some of Kumlian specimens and he made comparisons to Iceland gulls and to herring and glaucous wing gulls. And he decided it was something else. And he actually called it a lesser glaucous wing gull. That was the original name that Brewster gave it. And he also noted how similar this bird that Kumlian found was to the Iceland gull. Now let me show you an Iceland gull. Okay, so this is an adult Iceland gull on the left. And I mean, what should be instantly apparent is the ghostly white color to these primaries feathers. And of course, it also has a very light eye. It almost looks like a junior version of the glaucous gull that I showed you at the beginning of the program. The bird on the right is a first year Iceland gull. And this looks very much like the first-year glaucous gull. Now, they're not considered to be, you know, related. Maybe they are, but they're considered separate from the glaucous gull. Anyway, um, again, this bird has pure unpigmented primaries. Iceland gulls are something we don't see in Iowa. The what we call the nominate form. This is a map um, taken from Gulls of the America by Howell and Dunn. The Iceland gull, the nominate form, the one with the really pale wings, breeds in Greenland, and it winters out at sea or in Iceland and sometimes reaches Europe. These red areas on Baffin Island, and this red area is, it's northern Quebec. It's called the Ungava Peninsula. This is Southampton Island in the north of Hudson Bay. These areas are where Kumlian's gull is found. And Kumlian's gull typically winters in this area marked in blue. Many of the pictures that I got of Kumlian's gull were from Newfoundland. The Thayer's gull, on the other hand, breeds in these areas farther north. And some breed actually very close to where those Kumlians bred. Here's a colony near Home Bay on Baffin Island. Here's another one just north of Southampton Island. And these gulls, interestingly to me, winter mostly on the Pacific coast, although some reach the Great Lakes and visit us. There's a huge amount of intergradation between Thayer's gulls and Kumlian gulls, and this chart is just given to represent some of that. Now, this is the field guide that my dad gave me in '73. Fortunately, it was actually copyrighted in 1947. And so Thayer's gull is not in this. It is listed kind of in the subspecies section under herring gull. And I want to read, Peterson said that some Thayers come so close to Kumlians that it is a question exactly what they are. Now, he did list Kumlians, because everybody else did, as a subspecies of Iceland. And he actually put it in his field guide right here, this bird. And he said it's a recognizable race of the Iceland gull. Now, the first person to actually list Thayers as a separate species from herring gull was the guy who wrote this book, Earl Godfrey, in the Birds of Canada. And he listed it as a separate species based on a couple of things. First of all, there was a man named McPherson that did some really good research in 1961, where he showed that herring gulls were breeding, alongside Thayer's gulls, but they were not interbreeding. So if the breeding ranges overlap without interbreeding, this is considered the best test of a biological species. But he noted that he thought Thayer's gull probably should be a subspecies of the Iceland gull. And he said the characters shared by Kumlini and Thayeri included preference for cliff nesting, gregarious breeding habits, and possession of a purple-red orbital ring. Now, the only problem with making Thayer's gull a full species is the fact that we don't know what the relationship Thayer's has with these Kumlian gulls. And so Godfrey had some personal communications with a man who was doing research on that very topic. And every tale needs a villain, and our villain is Neil Griffin Smith. Now, Neil Griffin Smith should not be confused with our Neil Edward Smith, the Iowa congressman that lent its name to our wonderful wildlife refuge in Prairie City. Um, this man was from Brooklyn, and he was a PhD student at Cornell. And for 3 summers, like 1960 through maybe 62, he did research on gulls on Southampton Island, nearby White Island, and at Home Bay on Baffin Island. And he communicated to Mr. Godfrey and some others that he had found Theri and Kumlini breeding sympatrically, which means alongside one another without interbreeding, on Baffin Island. So Godfrey went ahead and made it a separate species in his book. The work that this Mr. Smith had done was considered ingenious by some and wacky by others. Um, he, he stated that he painted and changed orbital ring colors that introduced hybridization by establishing 55 Thayers and Glaucus pair bonds. Anyway, his article was featured on the cover of the October 67 issue of Scientific American. And unfortunately, it very quickly got some scathing criticism. And George Sutton was an eminent ornithologist, and he found it perplexing and discomforting that in one breath, Smith asked us to believe that the success of a gull's whole reproduction cycle depended on eyesight keen enough to keep it from wasting effort on a gull of the opposite sex. And yet this same gull will be fooled into considering a big black circle as an eyelid. Sutton says his findings are intensely interesting to speculate upon whether they be considered conclusive or not. Well, some others also questioned that what he had been doing up there was even actually done. They questioned that, whether he had falsified his research. To be fair, I guess, to Mr. Smith in some way, research in this part of the world is extremely difficult, and just Nunavut. It wasn't called Nunavut in the 1960s. Nunavut was just created in 99. Is an area that's nearly the size of Mexico and has a population of about 36,000 people. So there's very little infrastructure. The capital of Iqaluit, which used to be known as Frobisher Bay, I was just checking out this morning. A flight from Ottawa to Iqaluit will cost you $1,200. And even once you get there, you still got to get to the birds. Here is their capital, and on the tourism site, it says the sparkling jewel in Nunavut's crown. So there it is. The other thing is that these birds are cliff dweller nesters, and they're going to be hard to get to. You're going to have have a research vessel. I mean, trying to get to them over land would be extremely difficult. There are no roads, and it seems like that's a good bit of what Smith did. I saw some notes that he wrote from his research trip, and he has a note from. I think it was May 9th of 1960, where he noted on Southampton Island that it was negative 24 degrees that night. So I hate to think what it would be like this time of year. So he had a very good time, and it's one of the reasons why it's taken us so long to figure out things about these birds. It's just very difficult to do work here. The other problem is that we have a hard time telling the birds apart. So we don't know if we're researching Thayer's gulls or we're researching Kumlian's gulls sometimes. And there were some researchers in the later 70s that noted that cliffs that Smith said held Thayer's gulls they felt were Kumlian's gulls. Okay, so this is a photo of the 13th meeting of the American Ornithologists Union. And I bring these people up because this is the body that determines what we call our birds here in North America. This man right here is William Brewster from Boston. Joel Allen, um, let's see, he was at the American Museum of Natural History. And the guy next to him is in the gray coat is Elliot Coos. And all these guys have had birds named after them. These were the three founders. Other famous guys, I mean, you've heard of Bendier's Thrasher. This is Charles Bendier up here. Here's Frank Chapman over here behind the man with the hat. He was the one that started the Audubon bird counts in 1900 and also wrote one of the first handbooks on field guides on North American birds. Notice there are 3 women in here, although they're hard to pick out. I don't see any minorities, but of course, if you're in this group, you are a minority. Anyway, I bring these guys up because in 1973, okay, and this was quite a few years after Smith published his study on these birds, and we had received a lot of criticism about his work. In 73, they declared Thayer's a complete species despite all these reservations. And they maintained this until 2017. So in 2017, all this discussion about whether it's a Thayer's gull or a Kumlian's gull or an Iceland gull comes down to they're all Iceland gulls now. And kind of steals some of our thunder for birders like myself who grew up trying to figure out which was which. It's kind of anticlimactic. And I still, when I go out, I still like to try to decide which is which. But there are no Thayer's gulls anymore. They've been subsumed because Iceland gull was the first of these 3 birds that was described scientifically and named. And so now this is a map of Iceland gull. So we have around the coast of Greenland, we have the paler form that winter in Iceland and Europe. And to the very south or to the very north, let's say, we have the Thayer's form, which mostly winters on the Pacific coast. And then we've got what has been called by some to be a hybrid swarm. There are people who actually think Thayer's and Iceland should be separate species, and these birds considered hybrids are kind of in the middle, and they winter primarily on the Atlantic coast. This is not a gull. Had to see if anybody's still awake. But this is a bird that's very readily seen at Lock and Dam 15. Okay, I'm getting toward the end of things. I do feel like it's necessary. I've gone a long time, but I feel like it's necessary to mention just a couple other birds because they are typically seen on our trip. This is a lesser blackback gull. It's an adult. The first thing you should notice is the color of the mantle. this one looks pretty charcoal colored to me. Sometimes when I'm looking at them on the river, they seem to have a little bit more of a bluish, dark bluish cast to them. But they are intermediate in size between the ringbill and the herring. I think Sibley puts these at 21 inches long versus the herring's 25. Um, if you see an adult bird, it's pretty easy to figure out what it is. It's got bright yellow legs. The other dark-backed bird that we sometimes get is the greater black-backed gull, although we don't see that nearly as often as the lesser. And that has pink legs and is a lot bigger. So the lesser black-back adults are pretty easy to pick out. I think it's interesting that the first lesser blackback gull to be documented in North America was in 1934. This is actually a European bird. But every year we've been seeing more and more of them. And I think there's a breeding colony in Western Greenland. I don't know. There could be other colonies elsewhere that maybe we just haven't discovered yet that are closer. But this bird does wander a lot. It's a long distance migrant. And so they move around and we get them, and they get them all across the United States, even to the Pacific coast now. That's what they look like in flight. The first year birds look like something like this. Now, this one may be weathered quite a bit, but in general, they don't have that overall uniform dark brown like a herring gull. Um, they tend to be a little bit more kind of a salt and pepper look on the back. So, in some respects, they will stand out. You should recognize them. There's something different there. Here's another one, maybe not quite so worn. I like this picture because one of the interesting things about this bird is that it often has sort of a punched in the eye look. It's got this dark area around the eye that you just don't see in the other gulls. Also, whereas a herring gull might have sort of a fleshy base to the bill, lesser blackback often it's completely dark. And on the wing, you don't see that primary window like you do in the herring on the lesser blackback. You also don't see a big contrast between the secondaries and the greater wing coverts. So it's got kind of a wider brown kind of edge to the back of the wing. The rump is also much lighter than on the herring gull. Typically, the rump is closer to a ringbill as far as its lightness. And the other large gull that we sometimes see is the first year glaucous gull. Now, the younger birds tend to wander a lot more. Like I said, the adult birds are seldom seen in Iowa, but the first and second year birds are seen quite a bit every year. And the second year birds look pretty much like the first year birds, except the eye will be pale. So in any case, this is a bird that's actually larger than the herring gull. It's probably a little bit closer to a great blackback gull in size. Um, so maybe say 27 inches to 30 inches versus 25 to 27 for the herring. And I should have asked the question before I flipped the slide, but I think it's interesting that we do have a gull that actually breeds in trees, and this is a Bonaparte's gull. I showed you the winter kind of version early in the program, but they nest all across Canada and Alaska in the boreal forest, and I'm thinking I'm going to do something different with my Christmas tree next year. Okay, so if our moderators want to turn on the questions, discussion, whatever, I pretty much showed you everything I've got. I do have some pictures of I do have some pictures of some field guides if you're interested, but
Muted.
um, I'm pretty much I'm done with my talk. So
Okay, some of the questions include, are birds more vulnerable while they are molting? It looks like ragged feathers might not be as functional.
well, they're obviously not. Certainly, they're more vulnerable, and that's one of the reasons why the birds that I showed you that were molting are only missing a few flight feathers at a time. They have to be able to continue to do that. But for breeding birds, these molts will kind of they might start up, and then when they get active with their young, they might kind of postpone the molt for a while, and then after they're done, kind of giving all their energy to the nurturing of their offspring, then they'll resume the molt and try to accomplish that, oftentimes on the breeding grounds. But that varies a lot from bird species to species.
Another question is, is there a lot of discrepancy between the gulls you'll see on the Mississippi versus what you might see here on the reservoir, for example?
None.
You'll
None.
see the
Real.
same thing.
We're only an hour's drive away, which is like nothing for gulls. I mean, so well, I guess I would say this is that the Mississippi is going to have a lot more gulls than we do. And so, based on that, I mean, the probability that you would find something unusual is more likely on the Mississippi than it would be on the reservoir. We only have, the below the dam and our spillways in the wintertime, the roller dams in Coralville and Iowa City are probably the best place to look for gulls. Um, and typically, there might be a couple of dozen at most when I go visit. So I mean, when you look over in the river, sometimes you're looking at hundreds or more. So, but the species variety will be pretty much the same. Any of the birds that you can see on the Mississippi River could just as easily turn up in Coralville.
Okay, that's all the questions that came in, so.
Okay. Jerry, don't you have any questions?
Are you referring to me?
Yeah, you're my top student.
Oh, thank you very much. No, everybody has the same question they're not asking is, how do you keep all this straight? So it's been a very good talk, Chris. I've focused on a few things that I might remember and might actually be able to spot one of these days.
Oh, you'll get it. It's not that bad.
And
Well, I
Chris,
don't know.
I would like to say that unfortunately, because we were all muted, you couldn't hear the laughter, but you give a very funny talk.
Well,
So
good.
appreciate your humor. It was quite
Okay.
enjoyable. And I have to confess, I am not a gull person. My eyes glaze over when I look at a pack of gulls, a squabble of gulls. But now I'm intrigued. So thank you.
They are
I'm
intriguing.
going to start studying gulls. So thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Any other comments or questions? We don't have to do the chat for them. We can just ask Chris.
You need a scope, or can a good, decent pair of binoculars be good enough?
Well, let's see. Most of the seagulls are probably the size of a cat to maybe oh gosh, trying to think of a good medium-sized dog.